All right, welcome everyone. We are just getting ready to start the next advisor webinar, talking about the membership outcomes assessment today. I'm going to give folks just like one more minute to get logged on here, and then we will go ahead and get started. All right, I think we can go ahead and get going, and then other folks can join in as they're able to. Welcome, my name is Noah Borden. I'm the Senior Director of Educational Programs for Delta Upsilon, and as a part of that role, I coordinate our membership outcomes assessment, do so in conjunction with a company, a vendor that we contract with named Dyan Strategies. They really develop the assessment based on our desired outcomes, and they help us in measuring our membership experience. So appreciate you all joining us for the webinar today as we talk about what some of our results are looking like right now, and what it is we're hoping to do with some of this data. So I think it looks like we have some familiar names on our attendee list, as well as some newer folks that maybe have not been a part of some of these webinars in the past few years. So I'll probably do a little bit of kind of basic overview of what the membership outcomes assessment is, and kind of where this initiative has come from over the last 4 years, and then we'll dig a little bit more into the data, and also want to talk a little bit about what some of our initial findings have been, and then some things we're pulling out based on the 4-year cohort that we now have, and looking at some longitudinal data. As we're going through this, certainly feel free to type in questions at any point. Happy to answer questions and do what I can to make sure you have a good understanding of our data, as well as understand maybe how you can utilize some of this in your work with the undergraduate chapters. So to go ahead and jump in here, I think really where the impetus for this whole initiative comes from is really this question, right? Like, really trying to get an understanding of what is it that a young man can gain from an undergraduate experience in Delta Upsilon. And while probably we all have those anecdotal stories that we've picked up along the way, we may have even personal experiences about growth and development that's occurred through fraternity experiences and through membership in the organization. We really wanted to find a more in-depth and robust way of providing some evidence toward what it is that young men are gaining and learning throughout their membership experience, and also maybe to start to develop an understanding as to like what are some of the specific experiences, characteristics, interventions, which might actually facilitate the learning, growth, and development that we would like to see in a fraternity membership. So 4 years ago, we then launched this membership outcomes assessment initiative, really with the goal of measuring student behaviors, values, and attitudes, gauging that growth over time, and I think also gaining a better understanding of how members experience Brotherhood at the chapter level and how that Brotherhood impacts the environment within a chapter. I think we're also finding that this is providing a lot of great data around informing our chapter servicing efforts, as well as even informing the work for advisors and kind of on the ground support systems for the chapter, as we're able to better understand what the environment is within the chapter, what perhaps specific challenges, or maybe what might be behind some of the challenges that a chapter is experiencing, so that then we can implement effective tactics for improving the chapter. And this is also helping us in measuring the impact of fraternity initiatives, such as the Minimum Merit Standards Program. So, couple of things just to understand kind of some of the basics of this outcomes assessment. So like I said, we're in year 4, and where that's particularly exciting is, this is the first time that we've had a 4-year progression of the membership cycle. And so the individuals who were freshmen in 2015-16, when we first administered the survey, have now had an opportunity to take the survey 4 times throughout their 4-year membership cycle. And we did actually end up with a reasonable number of individuals who did take the survey all 4 years. I think we ended up with out of the 586 individuals who took the survey as freshmen back in 2016, 188 of them, or almost 33%, took the survey all 4 years. So about a third of that initial freshman cohort completed all 4 years of the assessment, which does give us, some pretty good and credible data for taking a longitudinal look at how individuals grow and develop over time. This particular survey has been administered January through March of the last 4 years. This year, we actually ended up with an 80% response rate. So we've been at 79 to 80% every single year, which is phenomenal, and certainly provides us with some excellent data. And probably most importantly, it really helps to ensure that we can have a lot of confidence that the data is an accurate and credible representation of our members' experiences and what our members think, believe, and experience. And so when we began this initiative in 2016, we were actually the only fraternity doing so. There was one other sorority that came on at the same time, Zeta Tau Alpha, but since that point, I think 5 other fraternities have now utilized the assessment, and actually several others have contracted with Dyan and will be utilizing the assessment. So where that's had some value is in providing us some additional comparison data and just helping to give us some additional context to understanding what our data means. So of course, this really then prompts the question, what are we learning from all of this information that we're gathering? I think, we're seeing some things that we can pull out on the individual level, the chapter level, and sort of the organizational level as a whole that are pretty interesting. Of course, as can be the case with a lot of these things, the more data we collect, sometimes the more questions it prompts. So certainly still lots of discussion to be had as we dig into what some of the data is saying. But a few points that I wanted to bring up just based on some of our initial analysis here. So Over the course of the last 4 years, some positives that we have seen are brotherhood belonging, which is an important measure that we've really been focusing on. This is, for those of you who haven't participated in these conversations before, this is a measure of brotherhood that's a part of there's a scale of 4 different areas of brotherhood, which are measured, and kind of the total look at where those 4 brotherhood measures are in a chapter and how that pattern comes together for a chapter really provides a lot of insight as to the overall chapter environment and how brothers are developing relationships and experiencing brotherhood within the chapter. So what we have seen across the board in the fraternity is belonging has actually been increasing over the last 4 years, which is definitely a positive to see, as this has really been a priority for us. This idea of belonging is really related to, obviously, kind of the connection that members experience within the chapter. But this is also really kind of the idea of, kind of a sense that my brothers value and appreciate me. My brothers understand me for who I am. I feel cared for by my brothers. And it's kind of getting into that home away from home concept. And we're really seeing this as one where if we focus on building up the belonging, then certainly we can hope to see some positive gains in other areas of value for the fraternity. Accountability is another measure of brotherhood, kind of more based on the idea of my brothers make me a better person. My brothers hold me to a high standard, and this is kind of related to both informal and formal accountability. This has really been kind of flat for us. So this is an area that we want to look to continue to develop in the future as we're looking at how to equip our brothers and our chapters with the skills to create more of a culture around positive and healthy accountability within their brotherhood. A piece that has gone down for us is social status importance, as well as the solidarity brotherhood measure. And these we'll look at these on some charts here in a minute, but the reason that these have been so important is these have also been kind of priority areas that we've identified, areas that we really want to address. The social status importance variable, this is one really looking at how much importance is placed on standing within the social hierarchy on campus. So kind of we want to be considered one of the cool guys on campus, so to speak, to put it in very plain terms. And this has been a variable that we have seen really correlate with some of the other variables more likely to lead to some problematic behaviors. And so really reducing this emphasis on social status we see as a way of helping to address some of the factors that could contribute to some unhealthy and high-risk behaviors by the chapter. The solidarity brotherhood is another one where, so this is kind of the idea of brotherhood based on, like, I've got my brother's back, we're there for each other, we take care of each other, and it can have some really positive aspects to it. But also when we see solidarity brotherhood get too high, then it really starts to get correlated with some of the more extreme and high risk behaviors that may be exhibited in a problematic chapter environment. And so bringing that down has actually really been a positive sign, as well as something that we have focused on in really trying to emphasize the development of healthy brotherhood relationships within a chapter. And so this just gives you kind of an overall picture. The fourth brotherhood variable is the shared social concept, and this is kind of the idea of brotherhood built around we do fun things together. We have a fun social experience together, which again is one where this needs to be an aspect of the experience, because we can't have a strong relationship, a strong brotherhood experience if we never spend any time and we don't enjoy doing things of common interest together, right? We need to have some fun with each other from time to time, but this can also become overly pronounced and can really lead to destructive behaviors or unhealthy relationships when the relationship really centralizes around that social experience. And so we don't want to see this get overly emphasized. And so you can see kind of this overall trend of that solidarity going down while the belonging goes up, where we also view that as a positive is actually all of these variables are associated with each other. And so typically when you would see one go up, they would all go up, or if you saw one go down, they would all go down. So to be able to bring that solidarity level down while improving the level of belonging and maintaining that level of accountability is actually a strong positive. And I think what to attribute that to, we don't necessarily know, but I think certainly looking at some of the things like implementing the new associate member education program, helping chapters develop, more effective associate member education practices, focusing on some of this in some of our education programming, some of the work on the ground by advisors, by chapter development staff, and implementing practices that really emphasize both accountability and belonging, and intervene around some of the behaviors that might lead to problematic solidarity have definitely had an impact. And so we see that in this trend, and certainly hope to continue to really emphasize that accountability and belonging in the practices that we support with our chapters. So that is just kind of a little overview of the brotherhood piece. Now I want to dig a little bit into this longitudinal piece and talk a little bit about what we've found from kind of our 4-year impact study here. What are we seeing from that first cohort of first-year students from 2016 and how they grew and developed over time. And I think, we're still digging into it, and we're still kind of trying to find the right questions to ask as we go through this. But thought I'd point a few things out. And then again, as we're going through this, if you have any questions or things that you're wondering about within the data or what some of this stuff might mean, certainly feel free to chime in. I think there's a lot of different aspects to this, a lot of things we could have pulled out. I just thought that I would pull kind of a few high-level things out of this and then kind of see where it is that folks wanted to take the conversation. So if we look at these same 4 brotherhood measures again, you can see that everything kind of starts off the highest for the most part in that first year, and then sort of starts to tail off. So interestingly, the solidarity drops pretty steadily every single year. I think it's interesting, you see that shared social tick up a little bit in the sophomore year and then go down, and you see actually the accountability and belonging really hang in there pretty good for that freshman to sophomore year, but then really start to decline, especially belonging from sophomore to junior, and then junior to senior. And so then we see this show up again on some of the other variables. We're really seeing that sophomore to junior transition as being one where we really start to see that connection to the fraternity fade. So a different variable to look at and how this develops over time. Again, I mentioned the social status importance variable before, and so this would be one where you really see that kind of decline steadily from sort of freshman to junior year, and then maintain into the senior year. So clearly this idea of importance of social standing, importance of the social hierarchy becomes less so as your time in the fraternity persists, which would probably be a positive thing there. And just kind of an interesting one, I thought there's this measure we look at of unethical pro-organizational behavior. So this is sort of a measure of ethical decision making. And it's really getting at the idea of I would be willing to engage in unethical behavior if it would benefit my organization. Right? And so you see that certainly kind of stay at the highest levels when individuals are most connected with the organization, and then sort of fade over time. And so, you know, this is one we would want to see decline over time, as we would want to be helping members to learn and develop more ethical decision-making and ethical leadership practices. Organizational ID is another interesting one to look at. So this is something that's really going to speak more to like kind of pride in the organization. It's getting at kind of the idea of the degree to which I incorporate Delta Upsilon into sort of my sense of self or my identity. We always kind of joke around with the guy in the chapter who's like always wearing at least 2 to 3 forms of letters when he leaves the house is year 5 on organizational ID. So, you know, always got the t-shirt, hat, and socks on at the same time. And so you see that kind of peak there in the sophomore year, and then really dip off in the junior year, and then fade a little bit more in the senior year. So again, kind of that sophomore to junior year being clearly an area where maybe there's some opportunity for some more engagement to maintain that connection, so that we are you know, hanging on to folks more so as they transition into their upper class experience. All right, it's a big messy chart here. I'm just going to throw everything in on this slide. Lots of colored lines here, but a couple of pieces that I wanted to point out from this. So these are areas where we saw some statistically significant shifts over time, and I guess, you know, as probably is the case with a lot of our research, you know, it ends up being kind of a mixed bag. You know, some things that are really strong positives, some things that are clear areas to work on, and some things that are probably kind of in between. And so what we saw here, I'll point out, need for cognition is that yellow line there, as well as we have social perspective taking, the red line, and the black line of self-authorship. You see all 3 of those on a trend, a positive trend throughout the 4-year experience. So that would be some real positives to point out and showing. So need for cognition is really getting at sort of problem solving skills and thinking skills, which would clearly be a skill we would want to see developing as a part of the undergraduate experience, as well as the fraternity experience. Social perspective taking would be a measure of kind of understanding another individual's perspective, being able to look at something from someone else's point of view. And self-authorship is really, it's almost kind of a measure of maturity, but it's getting at kind of identifying personal values as a foundation for decision-making and life experiences, and living life based on one's internal values as opposed to external pressures or externally defined metrics. And so seeing all of those trend up over time would definitely be in alignment with our desired membership outcomes, and something that we would want to see, and even something I think that we can positively promote in advocating for the value of a fraternity experience. This is evidence that some of these positive outcomes that we would like to see in an undergraduate experience and a fraternity experience are actually happening. Growth and development is happening. I know in some of these it does look like the shifts are pretty small and the numbers aren't that big. And this is where some of our large response rates definitely help. And so, because we're getting a good response rate here, and we have a decent sample size to work with, then we do see that even a smaller shift is statistically significant and meaningful, or likely to be meaningful. Now, certainly on some of the others that we see here, we had some declines. The lifelong learning variable declining a little bit. The openness to diversity kind of is really sort of going up and down, which is somewhat interesting. We saw several other kind of developmental outcome variables that we were looking at sort of trend up and down, so not necessarily conclusive there. And the political social involvement has really declined pretty starkly in the last 4 years for folks, which is interesting. That's just one that definitely find a little bit interesting. I don't know if there's something about their experience that's causing them to become less engaged or less interested in political social involvement, or if there's certainly some possibilities that we've seen some shifts and developments in just kind of the national and local political climates in the last 4 years, which may actually be contributing to that in some capacity. So just kind of an interesting one to look at. So, when we look at the whole picture here, I think we're left with definitely some positives to pull out, as well as some things to think about as, wanting to continue to work on how we're creating opportunities on the chapter level for members to grow and develop in some of these ways, and providing some additional support there around some of the desired membership outcomes that we're seeking here. Another thing that was interesting, our Dyan folks did some analysis on a few different factors to look at what might be some kind of ideal patterns of membership involvement. And I mentioned there's kind of that drop off in connection to the fraternity from sophomore to junior year. And so one of the things that they actually found that helped to offset that in some capacity was getting members involved in leadership roles. And so I think especially getting people kind of worked into leadership roles earlier in their process, but then having that continue beyond just a 1-year involvement. So, and certainly the later into their undergraduate experience that they were involved in leadership roles, then the more likely they were to not see that drop off, which, isn't necessarily shocking there, but is, I think, informative. And another piece was certainly related to housing. We saw living in housing for multiple years, and specifically also not living in freshman year were positive indicators toward offsetting some of those declines. And so the kind of the greater likelihood that we can, or to the greater extent that we can get individuals living in the chapter houses and participating in leadership roles or being actively engaged in roles in the chapter as upperclassmen, then certainly the more likely it is we can, overcome some of those declines in connection and engagement to the fraternity and to the Brotherhood as upperclassmen progress through their experience. Another interesting one with that was actually also there was some continued drop off for individuals who never lived in the chapter house, or certainly may not have had a chapter house to live in, but it actually was not that steep of a decline, and was not as bad as perhaps individuals who maybe only lived in the chapter house as like a freshman or only lived in as a sophomore. And so, actually probably gives us some evidence that, saying for some of our chapters that don't have housing, that's not necessarily indicative that there's no hope to maintain a connection there, because they don't have that housed experience. That we do see that those declines are not as steep. So just something interesting and something of note there. So that was one way that we were kind of trying to test the data, and we continue to try to play with this a little bit here. I want to kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about the chapter reports that we provided. So I think hopefully most of you would have received those if you're listed as a chapter advisor. They've been sent out, and we provide them to chapters when we visit or when they attend educational programs. But everybody gets a report that kind of looks like this, and so we include the Brotherhood scale with a comparison to both the DU fraternity average for the year as well as the kind of fraternity sample national average from Dyan, so you can kind of see how there's some comparison there. And then we also include several areas of kind of chapter strengths. So this would be several variables where the chapter scores perhaps well above average, or maybe some of the priority areas that we're really focused on where the chapter is doing particularly well. And again, we provide the chapter average as well as the DU average, and then provide sort of the rank, so to speak. And really the purpose for that is, again, just providing some context, because I think, you look at your normative commitment score as a 4.22. Well, that is pretty difficult to understand without having some sort of context to place that in. So then if you see like, oh, well, actually that is the second highest normative commitment score in the entire fraternity, then that would probably give you some indication that that's a pretty strong measure there for the chapter. And we also list some areas for improvement, and this might be areas where the chapter is below average, or maybe an area of concern, or maybe a priority area that we're trying to really focus on that year. And then I also included the areas of greatest change from last year to this year. I think sometimes that can be particularly informative, like maybe belonging is still pretty high, but it went down substantially, and then that might be something that you would want to ask questions of, well, why did this happen in the last year? Or maybe we saw, some improvements in a specific area that might be indicative of something that worked in the last year that we would want to continue. So that's why we have included that. Then in addition with the report, we'll also include just sort of some analysis there to try to provide a little bit more explanation and maybe give some additional thoughts on what some of this might mean for the chapter. And then we provide just some recommendations for things to work on, or some areas for improvement, and some things for how to operationalize some things stemming from what we see in this report. So I think some important things to keep in mind when reviewing the report, in one regard, this report represents, kind of one educated opinion as to what the data could mean. And so, this is not necessarily like the be all end all of all data analysis, right? That, there's always going to be more behind the data to help explain like why this is the case. The data can show that maybe there's an issue with lack of accountability within the chapter culture, but the data isn't going to be able to fully explain why that is the case. And so that's where the digging into kind of some chapter discussion and understanding the chapter better on the local level can help to pull out, well, what specifically needs to be implemented to improve accountability in this chapter, right? Certainly utilizing additional data such as like meta-merit and personal observations can really be informative in helping with that as well. And I think, this is great to really utilize this as a starting point for conversation. I was actually just down at the Indiana chapter on Monday and was visiting with those guys, ended up having a great 75-minute conversation with them about their chapter data, and we filled up the whiteboard and we're throwing some different data points out there, but it was really a lot of me offering some thoughts on what this data was, but then having them think about, well, what does this mean, and maybe even what was it that we were experiencing in the chapter that may have led to this being the case. And in doing so, try to remove some value judgment from the conversation. We're not necessarily presenting this to say like you're bad or you're good. We're trying to just understand maybe what might be happening in the chapter environment, what behaviors might be experiencing, what might be some attitudes of some individuals in the chapter, and maybe how might that be impacting some of our chapter operations, and then ultimately what is it that we want to do about that. And so some next steps here, we're going to continue analyzing longitudinal results and look at incorporating, what we learn into programming and continuing to emphasize belonging within that chapter experience. I think working with chapters to understand, from, the recruitment process to the associate member education process into really assimilation into just the regular member experience. What are things we can do to really prioritize and emphasize creating that sense of belonging and that sense of understanding and personal connection among members. Like I said, as the data set grows, it's continuing to give us some additional comparison data to look at. Certainly looking at what research questions we want to dig into in the future, and what are some things we actually want to learn from this, and then we're certainly looking for new ways to help chapters utilize the data in their operations, marketing, recruitment, brotherhood programming, etc. And I think something else, a new project we've been working on here with this, looking at almost kind of like performance metrics, trying to identify more of like what are some of the key variables that might speak to just overall chapter performance, and maybe starting to dig into what might be some of the things within a high performing chapter that's helping to create that. So we have a chapter that's really strong in belonging and accountability, where members have a strong connection, where they're creating a positive, healthy environment. And then we want to dig into really understanding what might be some of the practices that are really helping to facilitate those positive outcomes, so that perhaps we can then provide those insights to other groups and continue to provide greater insight as to what some of the behaviors and interventions might be that can help chapters to then replicate that positive environment across the board, and just what might be some of the things where we're going to get the most value for our effort in terms of chapter outcomes. So it's something that we're continuing to look at and continuing to dig into, but certainly in some of these initial findings, I think really driving that personal connection, as well as that sort of culture of accountability on both an informal level and a formal level, we're seeing is really facilitating a healthy and positive brotherhood connection. So that was sort of my quick, my quick overview of what some of our initial findings have been this year, and what we have been looking at, and some of our initial analysis of the data. As we keep looking at the 4-year results, I think this is going to continue to provide us with a lot of interesting thoughts and information, but certainly would open it up if there are any questions or anything else that people are wondering about from the data, or how to utilize this within the chapters. So I think if you have any questions, you can just use the chat box and submit those. If there are no questions, just a couple of additional thoughts I'll throw out there for advisors. Found the questions. Sorry about that. Okay, so we're going through questions. Kathy, I got you first. All right. So, do you think that organizational belonging is a predictor of an alumni involvement? If so, what is DU doing to promote alumni involvement? Kathy, I don't know. It would certainly make sense, I think, that if you feel a greater connection to the brothers in the organization, that would probably lead to alumni involvement and make you more likely to want to engage in the fraternity as an alumnus. However, I don't know that we've really looked at that a whole lot, and we haven't really been able to expand to measuring anything in the alumni experience. That's sort of uncharted territory probably in this assessment initiative, but is definitely, I think, a good thing to think about in terms of additional measuring. And I mean, certainly in terms of what DU is doing to promote alumni involvement, you know, that you are seeing kind of unrelated to the assessment, you know, initiatives to try to expand advising opportunities and build additional alumni boards, as well as, you know, trying to promote opportunities for individuals to stay connected with their chapters. But I do think that this is probably an area where we're looking at what some factors might be that would lead to greater likelihood of alumni involvement down the road is probably a good future research question to look at. All right, so Kevin, let's see, sorry to have missed this one earlier, but is this data only for the 33% of DUs who completed all 4 surveys over the past 4 years? Or is this data for all DUs over the past 4 years? Okay, so both. So like when I showed like the overall Brotherhood scores initially for every single year, that was our full data set of everyone. Now, when I showed some of these other results, let me scroll back here. So like when we were looking at some of the data and talking about how it dropped off from sophomore to junior year and looking at some of the outcomes data here, this was based only on the individuals who took the survey all 4 years. So yeah, so this was about 1/3 of the initial cohort of first-year students in 2016. All right. Whereas some of the other data that we look at, when we're just looking at like Brotherhood and DU over time, this slide is based on all of our data from all 4 years. Okay. All right, Chad. Political is probably reflective of 2016 being a presidential election year. You'll probably see a spike again next year. Yeah, I think that's actually going to be really interesting. I think that's entirely possible that we'll see an uptick in political engagement next year. Let's see, Scott Porter, is it possible for you to send me the slideshow? Yeah, I could definitely provide this for you. And we will also be posting the full webinar, the recording of this webinar. So if you'd like to show it to anyone, certainly you can access it on the website and show it to anyone that you would like. How do we plan to integrate this information into the associate member program? Good job, or good question. That is something that we continue to talk about. I think really the biggest thing at this point is trying to emphasize the development of sort of interpersonal connection, creating opportunities through the educational sessions and through the activities and associate member education for guys to just get to know each other better, to facilitate kind of open sharing, self-revelation, and trying to engage in activities that are going to develop kind of long-term meaningful relationships. I think really looking at utilizing this to try to better develop Big Brother programs and initiatives as well, and really try to emphasize the impact that can come from a mentorship relationship, and really framing the Big Brother as a peer mentor. I think it can really be an important part of kind of emphasizing some of these ideas. I think looking at sort of really clearly communicating and developing an understanding of expectations for membership, and kind of helping with that accountability piece. You know, another one that we're looking into, actually I had a good conversation, I don't know if Cody's on here or not, but yeah, Cody's here. Says he's inactive, so maybe he's ignoring me. But Cody Rother and I had a good conversation earlier this summer about looking at some additional things we could do around developing just for interpersonal skills and confrontation skills, but also really just conflict management skills, and looking at how we might do some things within the associate member program to help members just be better equipped to engage in the normal interpersonal conflicts that are going to exist within a brotherhood that can then help actually facilitate healthier relationships by being better equipped to resolve some of those issues amongst themselves. And so I think that's going to be one that that we will be hopefully digging into here in the next couple of months to develop some new programming around that. See, a couple more questions here. Do we have any data to compare this against other Greek organizations or even the undergrad population as a whole? Brad Bailey. Yeah, Brad, we do. You know, there was a few slides I thought about including, but I kind of didn't want to, you know, turn this into a 90-minute of just sort of barrage of data here. But, you know, we do have some comparisons with the other fraternities that have taken the survey to this point. I think we'll continue to get more as more of these groups come on board. And I think it's been, again, sort of a mixed bag at this point. I think what we have seen sort of just in general is some real positives. Actually, we have definitely done better than the majority of our peers on the solidarity and shared social measures, and a lot of sort of what you might define as some of the social measures, you know, some things related to even like hazing rationales, things related to like sexual assault mindset attitudes, things related to alcohol use, you know, some of those kind of risk related, you know, social culture related variables where we have tended to perform better than our peers. I think there have been some things like the variables related to actually like belonging, accountability, and then those tend to be closely connected to things like just organizational connections. So commitment, both affective commitment and normative commitment. Affective being more of like a sense of love and affinity for the organization, normative commitment being more of like a sense of obligation to the organization, looking at organizational ID, just some of the measures around sort of commitment, involvement, engagement. We have tended to be a little lower than our peers, so that has certainly been something to look at. So on the social status, we've definitely been lower, and we've been trending downward on that one. So that has been an interesting one where we've tended to be a little better than our peers. And then on some of the other kind of what I call the developmental outcomes related variables, we've kind of tended to be sort of all over the place, sort of better than some organizations on some, worse on others, kind of up and down, and not necessarily a specific trend that you would identify. But yeah, we have been able to look at some of this in comparison. We don't necessarily have like a whole Greek organization look here, but their sample set has gotten quite a bit bigger as they've worked with a number of campuses, as well as worked with some of these additional organizations. So we are able to start to get a little bit more comparison data, and like on the chapter reports where it shows the comparisons for the Brotherhood scale, that is comparing kind of all fraternity members that they have surveyed. But clearly that's just fraternity members. It's not being applied to any non-fraternity members, whatnot. So hopefully that helps to answer that. Let's see, one additional question. Do you have any insight as to how subsidy housing and loss prevention fee increases over the last 2 years may have affected the survey? I guess, honestly, I do not. Don't know that we necessarily have any information to indicate that fee increases would have affected the survey per se, unless potentially it was, someone had a shift in attitudes, or maybe it was less connected to the fraternity as a result of a fee increase or something. But certainly something that we can keep in mind as we're looking at how trends are developing over time. Certainly as we look at overall transition to substance-free housing, one of the things we can start to do is pull out chapters that are substance-free and compare it to experiences and attitudes for chapters that are not substance-free, and we'll continue to look at some of those trends over time to just better understand impact of that, as well as other loss prevention related interventions. So that looks like all of our questions at this point. Sorry for not catching those earlier, but I think we were able to get to everybody. If there are no additional questions now, then I'll just chime in that if anyone has additional questions, Chad, the chapters report. Well, yes, the fraternity is implementing substance-free housing as a full organization, but it hasn't gone into effect for the entire organization yet. So that's where we have some organizations that have opted to adopt substance-free housing in advance of the 2020 implementation date. And so, we can start to compare, is there any impact for groups that have opted for substance-free housing earlier, or maybe have already been substance free for a period of time. And then we can look at, how things shift once additional groups implement substance free housing in the future. And then there will also be the option for certain chapters that meet criteria to apply for a waiver in 2020. And so, that will also be something that we could look at to see, what's going on with groups that end up having a waiver for the substance-free housing program. But yes, you are correct that the substance-free housing policy is being implemented for the entire organization, but has not gone into effect fully yet until next year. So that was kind of what I was referring to there. So hopefully that straightens that up. Dan coming in with a question. Let's see here. One more thing. I'm not sure I understand how significant the changes are in each of the measurements from year to year. Is there, for example, a big difference in what is being measured for a score of 3.75 in 2016, a score of 3.57 in 2019 on solidarity? As a measure of brotherhood, is it more the trend that is important? How much different in the numbers might be significant or cause for us to question the validity of the data? Yeah, so good question, Dan. I think certainly scale does matter. I mean, if you see like solidarity shifts 0.02, that's probably going to be a lot less meaningful than if you saw a shift of like 0.5, right? I think that would be a very large shift. So larger shifts would be of a greater magnitude and something we would want to look at. Definitely trend over time, I think, is also an interesting thing to look at. So if you see a steady decline for 3 years, then that probably tells you more of an idea of something is going on there. And in terms of the kind of statistical validity, this is in part where like getting a strong response rate can really be important. When we have 90 to 100% of a chapter, completing the survey, then, basically any shift is likely to be statistically significant and credible in terms of indicating some sort of shift in attitude or experience. If a chapter has a smaller response rate, then certainly a small shift, like a couple of hundredths of a point would probably be less likely to be meaningful or statistically significant. And so that would be something you would have to take into consideration. And I think that can be also one where it might be valuable in some of those situations to just ask some questions, and say like, hey, why might these numbers be looking different, or was there something that occurred in the last year that might have led to this shift, to see if that's an area that requires attention, or if the shift is meaningful. And I think, Dan, as you're pouring through some of these things, this is also where, if you have questions about stuff like this, I'm happy to jump on the phone, have conversations with folks, talk about this. And even if, on some of these, I can provide some more data. We do have the full data reports for every single chapter, and certainly I'm happy to provide you with full data reports and show trends over time. The reason we just provide sort of the summary reports is because I think providing people with a full report with 40 different variables for 4 different years and comparison data can be a little bit overwhelming, and is a whole lot of statistics, but for individuals who would like to dig down a little deeper, certainly happy to do so. And definitely always happy to jump on the phone and talk through some of this stuff with advisors, or even with your full alumni board, or certainly even would be happy to call in or Skype in with an executive board or a chapter to discuss some of this further at any point if it would be helpful for you all. So so hopefully that helps to provide a little bit more explanation and help provide a little bit more of an update on what's going on and what we're learning here. So with that, I thank everyone for their participation. If you have additional questions or thoughts, feel free to shoot me an email or give me a call here in the office, and I'll look forward to working with you all down the road. And I think last plug, just want to also offer a big thank you to our alumni and our advisors. You know, I think this initiative is really continuing to be successful because we're getting good support from our chapters and a great response from our membership. And I think our alumni and our advisors are certainly having a strong influence in that, really helping us to drive that strong participation so that we can get this great data to work with. So really appreciate your ongoing work and support on this, and look forward to continuing to work with you. We'll post this webinar here in the next week as soon as we get it edited and put together, and then we'll get it uploaded to the website so you can share with others who are not able to participate in the call. So thank you all, and have a good afternoon.